Okay, so yeah, this is the what I hope to be the first in a series of talks about really simple, focused issues related to user experience. And normally I would have a title slide here, but in this case I actually want to keep the subject of it a little bit constrained until I get past the first bit. Then I'll tell you what it is that I'm getting at here. So to start off, very simple group exercise, and it should be a painless one. So I'm going to start off by talking, of course, about my microwave. John, I know you know where I'm going with this, so hold your thoughts on that. So specifically the clock on my microwave. This is a very typical sort of arrangement, and you know, in my neighborhood, a few times a year, the power will go out, and I'll get a message that looks like this: "As please press clock." You know, no big deal there. It kind of reminds me of the millions of VCRs from the 1980s that would be flashing 12 o'clock indefinitely because nobody could bother to set the clock on them. In the case of my microwave, the whole interface actually locks up when it gets like this. I have no choice but to set the clock. Fortunately, it's pretty easy. There's a clock button right there, AM, PM next to it. The instructions scroll along on the screen. So, you know, it's not like it's that big a deal, but it's a minor annoyance. Then you consider that this is a GE appliance. There have probably been hundreds of thousands, if not millions of these sold. And, you know, added up, that's kind of a lot of people's time wasted, a lot of annoyance added to the world in general. So petty though this concern might be, I mean, this is like the poster child for a first world problem, right? But, you know, I have to, oh God, I have to set the clock on my microwave. You know, nonetheless, it could be made better. So what I want to ask the group is, do you have any thoughts on any way we could make this better for the user? Anything hardware or software, messaging that could be displayed on the screen, anything like that?
Don't lock up the interface.
There you go. That's a really good one. Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Provide a battery backup to keep the time.
Good one.
The power skips.
Yep, absolutely. All right, maybe one more suggestion here.
Auto sync the time from the, was it the National Weather Service?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, absolutely. And that's another way we could go with it. So,
Wi-Fi uplink? Yeah,
right. Yeah, these days you really could. You could make it an internet-enabled appliance if you wanted to be insecure about it. So, yeah, we could do that. So all of those are great suggestions. So I have maybe a more straightforward question to follow up on so why exactly does my microwave need a clock in the first place? I'll just point out how ludicrous this is at a certain level. So there's this whole bank of buttons on my microwave that's specifically devoted to these time functions. It's got, you know, the dedicated clock, an AM PM button there. There's a reminder button for setting timed reminders. There's a timer in case apparently my countertop timer stops working. There's a scroll speed mode so that I can see the please press clock button faster if I want to. You know, this is the thing. Like, the funny part to me, those two options on the right-hand side, I literally never noticed in the 5 years that I've owned this microwave, up until the time that I started putting this presentation together. I never moved my eyes 1 inch to the right to see that they were there. I just didn't need them, didn't occur to me that that would even be there in the first place. The silliest thing, I think, is actually in the lower right here. Delay start. This is a microwave. It's not a convection oven. This is just a microwave. You don't preheat a microwave. That's usually the only reason you see that button on a regular oven, is so that you have a situation where, like, you want your oven to preheat before you come back home from work or when you're preparing for company. You don't, like, stick a whole frozen turkey in your microwave and then, like, set it to start defrosting at 3 a.m. Yeah, exactly. It's like, it doesn't work that way. You don't use the appliance that way, but nonetheless, this exists. And all of that complexity that went into this, I mean, we've got a total of 5 buttons, some with separate modes here, to deal with this one thing that is, frankly, not all that necessary.
I wonder what the help button does.
Yeah, me too. I've never tried it.
I bet you it's like scrolling text of the entire instruction manual across that little readout.
No, that's kind of what I speculate. I've absolutely no idea. I've never had the motivation to even try, because it's a straightforward microwave. It doesn't need a help button.
The possible button needs to be a 2-word button.
Oh, yeah. There you go. Absolutely. So, you know, keeping that in mind, this is what the subject of today's talk is all about, is minimalism in product design. So what do I mean by that exactly? And when you hear the word minimalism, you probably, well, you might think of something that's kind of like this, like something you'd see in an art museum where you sort of wonder when you look at it, does this mean something? Is it meant to represent something, or is it just abstract and it's supposed to kind of look good? Well, if you're really talking about minimalism in art, then it actually represents one end of a continuum, and it is representational art, but it's something that everything unnecessary has been stripped away from. So like in this case, the artist was going for the impression of a motion blur. Like if you took a photo out of the window of a moving vehicle, you might get something that looks kind of like that. And that was all that that artist was trying to convey. But, you know, this can be applied to anything. And like I said, it's sort of a continuum. So we have some choices. So how this might play out in practice, let's say that, for instance, we want to make a picture of a fox, all right, common subject in nature. So we have a lot of choices for how we could represent that. You could start off by, say, taking a picture of a fox. Just find a fox, take a photo of it. You could make something that is photorealistic or even hyper-realistic, where you're paying attention to every single strand of fur on it. You could make something that is more traditionally painterly, where you aren't paying as heavy attention to detail, but you're still going for, you know, more or less anatomical accuracy. It's supposed to still look like what it is for real. You could get more stylized and start stripping out, you know, even some of the anatomy now and make it look like, you know, more impressionistic, more the impression of the animal you're trying to convey. You could start smoothing out the lines even more, smooth out the colors, eliminate more detail, make it even more stylized. Then you could start eliminating anatomy altogether and just get the bare, simplest thing that somebody could look at and have a reasonable chance of guessing this is probably supposed to be a fox or maybe a stoat or, you know, whatever. But, you know, with minimal prompting, you could probably guess what that's supposed to be. And finally, you could strip away any shape whatsoever and just go for color. And you wind up with something like that. So, you know, this is a really rough overview of how this might go down. But as you can see from left to right there is a continuum of options. And there are different ways of looking at it. Now, here's the question for the art. Which one of these is the best?
Very subjective.
There you go. That's exactly the answer. It is subjective. There's the answer for what is the most appealing to you personally, and that's going to always be right for you. There's, you know, what if you wanted the best one for a company logo, for instance? What if you wanted the best for impressing your self-important art critic friends? If you wanted the one that's the best for making a cartoon about a fox? There's probably a good answer out of these selections for each one of those questions, but it does depend on the context, and that's the point. So getting back to something that's relevant to what we do, product design. Minimalism is also a trend in product design. It's not something that is strictly related to art. And taking an example like this teapot here, you can see that it has been stripped down to really what the bare minimum is that's necessary. It has a container to hold the water, but very minimal sort of ornamentation on it. The handle is simple, the lid is simple, the spout is simple, the lines are simple, the construction is simple. So whether you find this aesthetically appealing or not is kind of beside the point. In this particular case, this is just something that's been broken down to the minimum amount that's necessary. But let's take it to something that's maybe closer to what we actually do in software design, like a car engine. So if you have anything other than an electric car, your engine probably looks something like this, or if it's like something like, yeah, kind of, you know, and if it's like mine, it's covered in dust and it's a Honda instead of a Beamer, but you get the point. And it's this massively complex thing that has all these different moving parts that interrelate to each other, and you know, there's a computer embedded in that system that controls the fuel injector and, you know, every aspect of the operation of this engine. Hugely complex. Some small percentage of people understand this and are interested in that level of automobiles, but to most people, what they're really more interested about, beyond the fact that the car should just work, is what's happening on the inside, the controls that you actually see. And here, you know, you don't have a manual control over the fuel injector. You don't have individual choice about whether to, you know, the spark plugs are going to fire or not at any given moment while you're driving the car. As you know, you might be interested at that in some level, but most people just want the minimum things that are necessary at any given moment for driving the car safely, being able to pay attention to what's on the road, and having the important controls within reach. Everything else becomes optional. And these days, the most complex part of a car's interface on the inside is often the stereo system. It's, you know, we've gone down to the point where, you know, most cars are even simpler than this one because most cars are automatic shift instead of a stick shift. So this is, you know, one way to look at the situation that we are dealing with product design. We have something that's inherently very complex, like a car, but that we want to expose certain facets of to the end user, and we have a lot of choice about that. So before I get into maybe how you can start making those choices, I just want to talk about some of the engineering advantages to taking a more minimal approach to product design, to trying to eliminate features, eliminate things that are not strictly necessary for the end user. And many of these are pretty obvious. If you have less user-facing features, there's less to implement. It's easier to maintain because there's less of it. There are few opportunities to create bugs. There are fewer places for problems to develop in a deployment situation. The cost is lower because, again, you're eliminating bugs, you're making it simpler to maintain, you're eliminating features that you have to implement. It is easier to create polished work because you can focus more time and attention on the parts that strictly matter and ignore everything else. And I think the most important is the last point here, that it forces deeper thought about the product design from the ground up. When you're designing that car engine, it's important to take into consideration what the user actually needs control over versus what complexity you should bury deep within the design of the product at a structural level, so that, you're really driving the engineering decisions based on what you think, how you think the product is going to be used in the long run. And from a software engineering standpoint, we actually believe in a lot of this already. There are a lot of maxims that we abide by in software engineering and many other forms of engineering that we almost take for granted. The most obvious is just keep it simple, stupid. How many times do you hear that throughout your career for one reason or another? And it certainly applies to software engineering. The simpler solution is often the best solution. Avoiding over-engineering, there's a somewhat lesser-known acronym, YAGNI, stands for you ain't gonna need it. And that means don't implement something right now just because you could foresee that it might be useful in the future. Only implement what you actually have to implement at any given moment. Because if you don't have to implement it right now, chances are good that you ain't gonna need it. Murphy's Law applies to software just as much as it applies to anything in the physical world, and we all know that one. Many of the core aspects of programming, if you think about it, are focused specifically on creating a simple interface for something that is internally much more complex. We have functions and macros. Object-oriented programming is devoted to that principle, generic programming as well. If we want to talk about process, look no further than Agile, which is all about simplifying things as much as possible, but still keeping the process useful to everybody involved. So we believe in a lot of these principles already. And the question then is, how do we end up with this sort of thing? How do we wind up with a situation where nonetheless, even though we all abide by these kind of principles in our day-to-day lives, how do we end up with stuff that is not necessary, polluting our interfaces? Well, I don't know in terms of the microwave clock, but I can speculate. And I can take a good guess because I, too, am an engineer. And as engineers, we have, certain urges, let's say. You see this blank canvas of the LED display that's sitting there and unused most of the time, and you think to yourself, well, we not only have this display that could display the time, but we have a keypad to enter the time in, and it's sort of relevant to what I do with the microwave anyway. And what if you didn't have a clock in your kitchen? You might want this thing there, and heck, you might want a timer while you're at it. What else can we do with this? And it often becomes this urge to be creative and to add solutions and options to things because it is enjoyable to do it. It's part of what is appealing about engineering in general. Yeah.
You can also often, well, an oven has a clock, so I guess a microwave has a clock.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. Like by association.
Just by right.
Yeah, and I think probably for microwaves another factor is that somebody started putting clocks in microwaves. It seemed like a good idea, and after that, everybody else started putting one in there because that's the way the market headed. And it's not that big an impediment to the user if it is a messy implementation. So why not?
Because no one uses it anyway.
Well, yeah, but this is the thing. So keeping that in mind, this is the flip side of that. And as an engineer, you have this particular mindset in the way that you view the world. And it's a very creative mindset, and it's a very good mindset a lot of the times, but it's important to rein it in, or at least realize that sometimes it needs to be reined in. Because to the end user, the computer is not this limitless canvas on which your creativity can be applied. To most users, it's more like this Hieronymus Bosch hellscape of demons that are just barely contained by the surface facade of what the software's interface is. And if you don't believe me, think about any time you've had to supply tech support to a friend or family member who may be extremely smart, but is not all that tech savvy. and think about all the times that they blame themselves and say, oh, I'm so stupid, I can't use this thing, I just don't understand what's going on, and it's like they've committed this grievous sin, and that they have to go to you to exorcise the demons. It's like, it's just unbelievable, and so that, even in an audience like ours, where we have some very, very smart people, very scientifically minded, but not necessarily software engineers. And because it's a different domain, even though those people may be extremely smart, they're going to be uncomfortable with this. Just the same way that I'm uncomfortable dealing with the internals of my car's engine, even though at some level I know I could probably understand it if I devoted enough time to it. I don't want to have to. I don't want to have to see that. So, yet more reasons to keep things simple. Now, from a software engineering standpoint, we know that this is not the reality. The reality is more like the Tower of Babel crumbling under its own weight. But when you think about that, that's actually another good reason to avoid adding yet more stuff to the pile. The more we can eliminate, the less overhead there is. So, how do we do that? Well, actually, before I get that, I forgot I had another slide here. So let me just outline some of the end-user facing advantages of taking a more minimalist approach to software designing. It makes the user interface less intimidating if there's less of it to begin with. It makes it easier to learn. Again, there's less of it to learn, easier to master for the same reasons. It creates fewer opportunities to use the product wrong. It creates a better first impression because it looks cleaner, it looks more obvious to what you need to do to get the job done. And also, because of all of that, it's obvious that more attention has been paid, that there has been more focus on the parts that really, really matter to the user, rather than ancillary things that were more of interest to the people designing the software than the people who were going to be using the software. And that's really the thing to keep in mind while you're designing a user interface, while you're working on user experience, is what is most important to the end user. And set aside what you think could be neat or fun or interesting, and just think about what the end user's impression of this is going to be. All right. So here's a suggestion in terms of, this is from writing, for fiction writing specifically, or often for fiction writing. This is usually attributed to William Faulkner, but it was actually this guy from Cambridge named Arthur Quiller Couch, who nobody's ever really heard of, but William Faulkner people find memorable. So this is not about going out and killing people, all right? This is not even about killing your characters. What this means is that when you have written something, a piece of prose that you find personally enjoyable, that you find poetic, you think is some of your best writing, and you just love this one section of your book or your essay or whatever, you need to take a critical eye at it and think about, does this really contribute to the overall thesis that I'm trying to present? And if it doesn't, you have to be able to get rid of it. And this applies so precisely to software engineering. Think about how much easier it is and much more fun it is to implement something from scratch than it is to get rid of something that you've already implemented, especially if it's in a deployed product. It's so much less painful to just set it aside from the get-go, or to realize early on that maybe this isn't as important as I thought it was, and to make that tough choice before it ever reaches the hands of the user. So that's one of two suggestions that I have for ways to think about this. The other one is much more well-known in the realm of user experience, and that is this quote that is often attributed to Einstein, and it's sort of related to something that he said, that you should try to make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so that speaks to the other end. So the first was about trying to get the courage to eliminate what is unnecessary. This quote is more about eliminating things that are unnecessary, but knowing when to stop, when to not eliminate further. So I would be remiss if I didn't give an Apple-related example in this presentation. So here goes. So back in the late 90s, people started making MP3 players. And it wasn't too long after that Apple introduced the iPod, their take on it. This was in 2001. And when this came out, a lot of people in the kind of tech geek circles that were typically the audience for the MP3 players up until that point had a lot of negative things to say about it. This is one of the more famous quotes. I have to confess, I was actually in this camp at first as well. I thought the iPod was totally going to fail. I thought it was too expensive. I thought there were too many opportunities for features they could have had in there that they just wiped out. That was pretty wrong. So by 2007, 100 million iPods had been sold, and that sort of morphed into the iPhone. So you can see, in a way, if you were really going for something that had broad appeal, Apple probably took the right approach with this. All right, so skipping ahead a few years. Then Apple came out with this thing, the iPod Shuffle. And again, a lot of people looked at this and thought, wait a second, now you're not only eliminating useful features, it doesn't even have a screen. You can't even tell what's on it. Forget playlist management. All you can do is like clip this to your shirt and play some songs either in sequence or in random order, and control up, down volume and the backtrack and forward track and pause. And so a lot of people, again, were skeptical that this was going to find any kind of market, especially since every MP3 player on the market until that point, it had a display of some kind. Well, these also sold like hotcakes. But that's not the interesting part of the story. So this was the second generation iPod Shuffle. The third generation iPod Shuffle, which most people have forgotten about, looked like this. That is the front of the device. That is real. So literally no buttons on this thing. And you may be wondering, how the hell do I control this? Well, the answer to that is like what you may have on your cell phone headphones these days. It's this little nodule that's in line with the earphones that has up, down volume, and then this sort of nebulous button in the middle that still doesn't seem to replace all of the functionality. Well, so the way that you operate this thing, Apple helpfully provided this cheat sheet for you, where now to go backwards, you have to like triple click the thing. To scan backwards, you triple click and hold it. To move forward, you double click and hold it. And you have to have all this memorized, or else you take this thing with you in your pocket. Oh, by the way, if you want to use your own headphones on this, tough luck, because you can't. It has to have the inline controls, or you can't even start the audio, much less use it. But again, Apple has made a lot of daring decisions in their product design. They've often eliminated things that people thought were really critical. Is this another example of that? So here's the fourth generation iPod Shuffle. That design was barely a flash in the pan. And, so like that speaks to the eliminate as much as possible, not more than is possible. And so at a certain point, you need to know when to stop. But that also gives a good example of what an extreme is. And most people wouldn't try pushing a design to that level of extreme. It becomes uneasy. The more of things that you eliminate, the more you start to wonder, am I really eliminating something that is critical? The more difficult that problem becomes to solve. And again, we're talking about a continuum here. There is no one product design on here that is the right answer. Each one of these found an audience. Even the goofy iPod Shuffle on the far right, that still sold. It just didn't sell as well as Apple wanted it to. But each of these has found an audience, and it was designed for a reason, and it may have been a good choice or not, depending on who they were trying to target. If you're trying to target a runner, you probably don't want the design that was made for somebody who is a DJ in a club, and vice versa. So again, you have to look at who your audience is and make critical decisions about it. So getting back to the microwave. So a few months back, I griped about this to John after one of the times when my power went out, and I had to reset my microwave, and I came in the morning. I was like, prism, I have to deal with this. And, gave my whole spiel to him, and we kind of laughed about it. And then the day after that, John came back, and he said, but, I actually use the clock on my microwave all the time. And so do I. I've got to admit, I absolutely do. It is the clock that I use the most often in my kitchen because it is there. It's at eye level. It's convenient, and I have to think that is actually probably the reason why that has been propagated. It doesn't mean that feature couldn't have been improved. Everything that everyone said in here about battery backups, about listening to the broadcast time so that it sets the time automatically, that would all be great. And these days, all cheap options, and those should be considered. But sometimes even if something is not directly related to the functionality that you're dealing with, sometimes it's a good idea anyway. So there is no right answer. And that's why I don't have a lot in this presentation about like specific lists of tips to go down through. It's more about a particular mindset and about having these factors in mind when you're designing your software. There is no set of steps that you can go down reliably and say, this is the answer. There's no formula. You just kind of have to live with it. And everyone can do it. There is nobody who does not have this capacity. So finally, to close. This is the quote that Einstein actually said, and this is one of his published papers, and says, it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. So no doubt that made great sense to Einstein's target audience. As someone who is neither a physicist nor a genius and is just a layperson, I prefer the simpler approach. And I suspect that most people do because that's what people remember. So that's it. Thanks.